The library book cart squeaked as David Wells pushed it down the narrow aisle between the history and science sections. 3 wheels rolled smoothly, but the 4th one had developed a mind of its own and insisted on spinning sideways every few feet. David had learned to work around this quirk, just like he had learned to work around the broken heating system, the temperamental computer terminals, and the coffee machine that only worked if you kicked it twice and said please. Being a substitute librarian meant dealing with all the problems that nobody else wanted to handle. Regular librarians got to work with organized collections and functioning equipment. Substitute librarians got buildings that seemed held together with hope and determination. David didn't mind too much. He actually enjoyed solving small problems and helping people find what they needed. The afternoon was unusually quiet. Only a handful of patrons browsed the shelves, and the usual group of teenagers who came to use the free internet had not shown up yet. David used the peaceful time to catch up on reshelving returned books and fixing the card catalog drawer that had been sticking for weeks. Mrs. Chen approached the reference desk carrying a stack of printouts and looking confused. She was one of David's regular patrons, a sweet elderly woman who came in twice a week to research her family genealogy, but struggled with the computer databases. "David, dear, could you help me again? This machine printed out something strange." David looked at the paper she handed him. The genealogy website had somehow printed out what appeared to be a recipe for banana bread instead of her family tree. He smiled and guided her back to the computer terminal. "Let me show you how to get back to the right page," he said patiently. "Sometimes these websites have advertisements that look like buttons, and clicking on them takes you somewhere unexpected." While helping Mrs. Chen navigate back to her research, David noticed something odd outside the tall windows. People on the street had stopped walking and were pointing up at the sky. A few had pulled out their phones and were taking pictures of something David couldn't see from his angle. "That's very strange," Mrs. Chen said, looking toward the windows. "Why is everyone standing around like that?" David finished helping her print the correct genealogy information and walked over to investigate. Through the glass, he could see a crowd gathering on the sidewalk. Everyone was looking up, but the library's windows didn't allow him to see what had captured their attention. The electricity flickered once, then twice, then went out completely. Emergency lighting clicked on, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. David heard car alarms going off outside, followed by what sounded like sirens in the distance. "Oh my," Mrs. Chen said nervously. "I hope everything is all right." David was about to reassure her when every electronic device in the library suddenly turned on by itself. Computer monitors that had been dark lit up with the same image. The old television in the children's section crackled to life. Even the digital clock on the microwave in the staff room began displaying something other than the time. The image was of a creature that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. It stood upright like a human, but had the scaled skin and elongated head of a lizard. Its eyes were large and golden, and when it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Citizens of Earth," the creature began, its words somehow perfectly clear despite the electronic interference. "I am High Commander Thos of the Hegemony of Worlds. Your planet has been selected for evaluation." David stood frozen, still holding a book about local Portland history that he had been about to reshelve. Around him, the few remaining library patrons stared at the screens in shock and disbelief. "Your species will be given an opportunity to prove its worth through trial by combat," the alien continued. "You will select your most capable warrior to represent your world in the trials of Dominion. Success will grant your planet membership in our galactic community. Failure will result in your world's incorporation as a labor colony." Mrs. Chen gripped David's arm tightly. "Is this really happening?" she whispered. The alien's message continued with details about the selection process and deadline. David found himself thinking that this was like the worst possible reference question a patron could ask. How do you help someone find information about alien invasions and galactic trials when your entire reference collection was written by and for humans? When the broadcast ended, chaos erupted outside. David could hear shouting, car horns, and what sounded like breaking glass. Inside the library, the small group of patrons looked to him for guidance, as if being a librarian somehow qualified him to handle first contact with hostile aliens. "Should we call someone?" asked Mr. Thompson, who had been quietly reading newspapers in the periodicals section. David considered this. "I'm not sure who we would call. I doubt the police have protocols for this kind of situation." Over the next several hours, David did what he always did during any crisis. He helped people. When Mrs. Chen couldn't reach her daughter by phone, he helped her compose an email. When Mr. Thompson wanted to understand what the aliens had said, David wrote down the key points from memory. When parents arrived looking for their children, he checked the library's sign-in log and helped coordinate reunions. The library became an unofficial community center as people sought somewhere quiet to think and plan. David found himself answering questions he never could have imagined. How long would the trials take? What kind of warrior would Earth choose? What would happen to families if the planet became a labor colony? He wished he had better answers to give them. 2 days later, David was organizing the returned book bin when 2 people in military uniforms entered the library. They looked serious and official, and they were scanning the room as if searching for someone specific. "Excuse me," the taller one said, approaching the reference desk. "We're looking for David Wells." "That would be me," David replied, setting down his stack of books. "Is there something I can help you with?" The soldiers exchanged a look that David didn't like at all. "Mr. Wells, you've been selected to represent Earth in the alien trials. We need you to come with us immediately." David laughed, thinking they were joking. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm just a librarian. Surely you want someone from the military or maybe a professional athlete." "Sir, our records clearly identify you as the selected candidate. Time is running short and the transport is waiting." Before David could explain that this was obviously an error, before he could suggest they double-check their paperwork, before he could even say goodbye to Mrs. Chen, one of the soldiers produced a small device that made a soft hissing sound. David felt a sharp pain in his neck, and the library began to spin around him. His last coherent thought was that he really should have organized the returned books before leaving. Mrs. Chen was going to have trouble finding her genealogy materials without help. Metal hummed beneath David's feet as consciousness slowly returned to him. The surface he lay on vibrated with a deep, rhythmic pulse that felt like the heartbeat of some enormous creature. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was a ceiling that seemed to flow like liquid mercury, constantly shifting and reshaping itself in patterns that made his head ache. David sat up carefully, his body still sluggish from whatever the soldiers had injected him. He was in a circular room with no visible doors or windows, though somehow he could sense vast open spaces beyond the curved walls. The air tasted different here, cleaner but with a metallic edge that reminded him of the smell after lightning strikes. His cardigan was wrinkled, and one of his shoes had come untied, but otherwise he appeared to be unharmed. More importantly, he still had his library badge clipped to his shirt pocket and somehow still clutched his copy of Medieval Siege Tactics in his left hand. The familiar weight of the book was oddly reassuring in this completely alien environment. "Awake at last, small creature." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the walls themselves. David looked around but saw no source for the words. Then a section of the wall simply dissolved, revealing an opening large enough for something much bigger than a human to pass through. What stepped into the room made David's breath catch in his throat. The being was easily twice his height, with skin that looked like polished stone and eyes that glowed with their own internal light. It moved with fluid grace despite its massive size, and when it spoke again, David could see rows of crystalline teeth. "I am Sub-Commander Varix," the creature announced. "You will be prepared for presentation to the High Command." "There's been a mistake," David said, struggling to his feet. "I'm not the person you're looking for. I'm just a librarian." Varix tilted its massive head, studying David with those glowing eyes. "Curious. Your species' neural patterns indicate truthfulness, yet our intelligence clearly identified you as a combat specialist." "Your intelligence is wrong," David replied firmly. "I've never been in a fight in my life. The closest I've come to combat is mediating disputes between patrons who want the same computer terminal." "Fascinating," Varix said, though it didn't sound particularly concerned about the mix-up. "The High Command will find this deviation from predicted parameters most interesting." Before David could protest further, 3 more beings entered the chamber. These were clearly from different species, but all shared the same predatory grace that suggested they were designed for violence. David felt like a mouse who had accidentally wandered into a convention of tigers. The first newcomer was vaguely humanoid, but covered in what looked like metallic scales that shifted color as it moved. Half of its face had been replaced with mechanical components that whirred and clicked as they tracked David's movements. I am Nira of Kef Prime, it announced in a voice that was part organic, part synthetic. I have triumphed in 47 death matches across 3 star systems. The second being was enormous and covered in thick fur that ranged from brown to silver. It stood upright but moved with the rolling gait of something more comfortable on 4 legs. When it opened its mouth to speak, David could see fangs that could probably bite through steel. Krog of the Ice Worlds, it rumbled, its voice like distant thunder. I have faced the winter demons in single combat and emerged victorious. The third being was the most unsettling of all. It appeared almost human at first glance, but something about its movements suggested that its bones and joints worked differently than they should. It carried more weapons than David could count, and its pale eyes seemed to catalog every possible threat in the room. It didn't introduce itself, just nodded once in David's direction. That is Senna of the Burning Sands, Varix explained. She speaks only when necessary, which is rarely. David looked around at his fellow champions and felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. Hello everyone. I'm David. I work at a library in Portland, Oregon. The silence that followed was profound. Nira's mechanical components whirred as they processed this information. Krog's massive head tilted like a confused animal. Even Senna's pale eyes focused on him with what might have been curiosity. What is a library? Krog finally asked. It's a building where people store books and information, David explained. People come to research topics, read for pleasure, or get help finding specific information they need. You are a keeper of knowledge? Nira asked, her synthetic voice carrying a note of interest. I suppose so, though mostly I help people with computer problems and make sure teenagers don't damage the books. Varix made a sound that might have been laughter. Your species has sent a record keeper to compete in trials of combat. This will be entertaining if brief. The trials test more than just fighting ability, Nira pointed out. My cybernetic enhancements include tactical analysis programs that have studied thousands of previous competitions. Success requires strategy and intelligence as well as physical capability. True, Krog agreed. On my world, the strongest warriors are not always the smartest ones. Sometimes the small ones who think carefully survive longer than the big ones who only know how to fight. David felt a tiny spark of hope. I may not be much of a fighter, but I'm pretty good at research and problem solving. At the library, I help people find solutions to all kinds of difficult questions. What kind of questions? Senna asked quietly. It was the first time David had heard her speak, and her voice was surprisingly gentle. Well, last week I helped a woman trace her family history back to Ireland in the 1800s. The month before that, I helped a student find obscure scientific papers for a thesis about renewable energy. Yesterday I helped an elderly man figure out how to video call his grandson. The other champions exchanged glances. David realized that his examples probably sounded completely useless to beings who were trained for combat. Your species is strange, Nira observed. Most civilizations send their most violent warriors to represent them. You speak of helping others and sharing information. Where I come from, David said carefully, we believe that the best way to solve problems is to work together and share what we know. Violence is usually a last resort when all other options have failed. Krog made a rumbling sound deep in his chest. On my world, we have a saying, the warrior who never fights wins every battle. Perhaps your people understand something that others have forgotten. Perhaps, Varix interjected, your people are simply weak and will be easily conquered. The trials will determine which interpretation is correct. Guards arrived to escort them to their quarters. As they walked through corridors that defied basic principles of architecture, David found himself beside Nira. Her mechanical components hummed softly as she moved, and her organic eye studied him with obvious curiosity. You seem different from what I expected, she said quietly. Different how? Most warriors speak of their victories and their strength. They boast of enemies defeated and battles won. You speak of helping people and solving problems without violence. David considered this as they walked past walls that seemed to show scenes from alien worlds. Maybe that's because I don't think of other people as enemies to be defeated. Even when someone is angry or upset at the library, they usually just need help with something. If you can figure out what they really need, you can usually find a way to help them. Your species is indeed strange, Nira said again. But this time she sounded thoughtful rather than dismissive. Yeah, David replied, looking around at the impossible alien architecture surrounding them. I'm starting to think that might actually be a good thing. Artificial gravity shifted beneath their feet as the transport ship prepared to dock with something much larger. David pressed his face against the small porthole in his quarters and gasped at what he saw outside. The structure they were approaching was so massive that he couldn't see its edges, just an endless expanse of metal and crystal that stretched beyond the horizon. "The arena of first trials," announced a mechanical voice throughout the ship. "All champions report for equipment assignment and briefing." David gathered his few possessions, making sure his library badge was securely fastened and his book was safely tucked under his arm. He had spent the journey trying to prepare mentally for whatever was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of stepping into a space that felt larger than most cities. The equipment bay was filled with weapons and armor from dozens of different worlds. David watched as the other champions selected gear with practiced efficiency. Nira chose additional cybernetic enhancements and energy weapons. Krog picked up what appeared to be a warhammer that was larger than David's entire body. Senna gathered an assortment of blades and projectile weapons that seemed to vanish into hidden pockets in her clothing. When David's turn came, he stared at the overwhelming array of deadly instruments and had no idea where to begin. Everything looked heavy, complicated, and designed for people much more violent than him. "Choose quickly, human," urged the alien equipment master. "The trial begins in moments." David selected the smallest weapon he could find, something that looked like it might be a stun device, and a utility belt that seemed to have pockets for various tools. Everything felt awkward and foreign in his hands. They were escorted to a vast chamber that opened onto what could only be described as a nightmare landscape. The labyrinth of first trials stretched before them, a maze of corridors and chambers that seemed to twist and shift even as they watched. Strange sounds echoed from within its depths, and the air that flowed from the entrance carried scents of ozone and something that might have been fear. High Commander Thos materialized on a platform suspended above the maze entrance. The alien leader looked down at the assembled champions with obvious satisfaction. "Welcome to your first test," Thos announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "This labyrinth has challenged champions for 1,000 years. It adapts to each challenger, presenting obstacles suited to their nature and methods. Reach the center and claim the trial crystal to advance. Fail, and face the consequences." David studied the entrance to the maze while Thos continued his explanation. The archway was covered with symbols that looked familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he had seen them before. They were arranged in groups with connecting lines between them, creating patterns that reminded him of something from his work. "Champions, you may begin." Krog immediately charged into the maze with a battle cry that shook dust from the ceiling. His strategy appeared to be straightforward: smash through any obstacle and overpower any creature that got in his way. David could hear the sounds of combat echoing from the corridors he had chosen. Nira approached more systematically, her cybernetic eye scanning for energy signatures and structural weaknesses. She moved with mechanical precision, calculating optimal paths and threat assessments as she advanced into the maze. Senna simply seemed to melt into the shadows near the entrance, becoming practically invisible as she began her own infiltration. David lost sight of her almost immediately and wondered if that was exactly what she had intended. David stood at the entrance for several minutes, studying the symbols while the other champions disappeared into the maze's depths. Gradually, the arrangement began to make sense. The symbols weren't random decorations or mystical runes. They were organizational markers, similar to the classification systems used in libraries. Different symbol groups seemed to represent different categories of challenges. Combat markers led toward passages filled with aggressive creatures and weapon-based traps. Stealth indicators pointed toward areas with surveillance systems and detection devices. But there were other symbols too, ones that suggested intellectual challenges and information-based puzzles. David chose a path marked with symbols that looked like they might represent research and analysis. The corridor he entered was quieter than the others, with walls covered in more symbols that created increasingly complex patterns. Instead of rushing forward, David took time to study the markings and understand their logic. The first challenge he encountered was a room filled with floating platforms, each marked with different symbols. Standing on the wrong platform would apparently trigger some kind of trap, but David approached it like a filing system. The symbols on each platform corresponded to categories from the entrance markings. By treating it like a cross-reference problem, David was able to navigate safely across the room. The creatures he met in this section of the maze were unlike the monsters the other champions were probably fighting. Instead of attacking him, they seemed more like confused researchers who had lost their way. They would block his path and demand credentials or authorization before allowing him to pass. "State your purpose in this section," commanded a floating orb covered in what looked like blinking eyes. "I'm conducting research on maze, navigation and information, classification systems," David replied honestly. "I need access to the central data repository." The orb considered this request seriously. "Your credentials?" David showed his library identification badge. The orb examined it carefully with several of its eyes before moving aside. "Proceed to research section, C7. Please maintain proper documentation. Standards." This interaction taught David something important about the maze. It wasn't just a series of obstacles to overcome through force or stealth. It was a responsive environment that adapted to the approach each challenger took. If you came in fighting, it gave you things to fight. If you came in sneaking, it provided challenges suited to stealth. If you came in as a researcher, it treated you like someone who belonged in an academic facility. David made his way through increasingly sophisticated puzzles, each one designed like the kind of reference challenges he dealt with daily at the library. He organized scattered data fragments into chronological order. He decoded messages written in alien filing systems. He even helped several lost creatures find their way back to their proper sections of the maze. The deeper he went, the more the maze resembled an enormous, disorganized library. There were reading areas filled with books from different worlds, computer terminals with databases in dozens of alien languages, and storage areas containing artifacts that had clearly been collected for research purposes. At the heart of the maze, David found something completely unexpected. Instead of a treasure chamber or combat arena, the center was designed like the reading room of an ancient library. Shelves stretched up into darkness filled with books and scrolls and data storage devices from across the galaxy. In the center stood a pedestal holding a crystal that pulsed with gentle light. But the crystal was guarded by the most magnificent creature David had ever seen. It resembled a spider, but was made entirely of living crystal that refracted light into rainbow patterns across the walls. Its body was the size of a small car, and it moved with careful, deliberate precision as it organized stacks of books and artifacts around the crystal. David watched for several minutes before he understood what was happening. This wasn't a monster guarding treasure. This was a librarian trying to maintain order in a collection that had grown far beyond its ability to organize properly. The creature was attempting to sort and catalog items that champions had scattered during previous trials. Instead of trying to fight or sneak past the guardian, David approached slowly and politely. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I can see you're working on a major cataloging project. Is there anything I can help you with?" The crystal spider looked up from its work, its faceted eyes reflecting David's image in countless directions. When it spoke, its voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "You do not come to steal or destroy. I'm a librarian too," David said, showing his identification badge. "I understand how overwhelming it can be when a collection gets out of control. What organizational system are you trying to implement?" The crystal spider explained that it had been trying to maintain the maze's vast collection for centuries, but champions kept breaking in and scattering everything while attempting to steal the central crystal. The trial crystal, it turned out, was actually the master catalog for the entire collection. Without it, nothing could be properly organized or located. "What if we made an arrangement?" David suggested. "I need to take the crystal to advance in the trials, but what if I promise to return it when the trials are finished? That way you could complete your reorganization project." The spider considered this proposal carefully. "You would return the master catalog, even though keeping it would mean victory and power." "A library's catalog belongs in the library," David said firmly. "Information should be accessible to everyone who needs it, not hoarded by individuals." The crystal spider carefully lifted the trial crystal from its pedestal and placed it in David's hands. The crystal was warm and seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "You understand the true nature of knowledge, small librarian," the spider said softly. "Perhaps there is hope for wisdom in this galaxy after all." David emerged from the maze to find chaos in the observation chamber. The other champions were still struggling with their respective challenges, and alien officials were arguing loudly about what they had just witnessed. "Impossible!" High Commander Thas was shouting. "The human reached the center in half the time of our fastest recorded completion." "The maze logs show no combat activity in his section," reported a technician. "No stealth protocols were triggered either. The human appears to have collaborated with the Guardian entity." David held up the trial crystal, which was now glowing with warm, steady light. The arguing stopped as every alien in the chamber turned to stare at him. "I helped reorganize the filing system," David explained simply. The Guardian was very grateful for the assistance. Crystalline walls hummed with energy as David was led into the chamber of strategic trials. The room defied every principle of architecture he understood, with surfaces that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his mind could properly process. Floating platforms drifted through the space like islands in a sea of stars, each one equipped with control interfaces that looked more advanced than anything Earth had ever imagined. The second trial tests mental acuity and tactical reasoning, announced Sub-Commander Varix as the champions gathered on the central platform. "Each of you will face scenarios designed to challenge your cognitive abilities under pressure. Victory requires more than physical prowess." David watched as the other champions were assigned to their testing platforms. Krog landed on one that immediately displayed what appeared to be a hunting scenario, involving massive predators on an ice world. Nira found herself commanding a fleet of starships in what looked like a complex space battle. Senna's platform showed an urban environment where she needed to eliminate specific targets while avoiding civilian casualties. David's platform rose to meet him, its surface adjusting to his height and providing what looked like a comfortable command chair. The displays that surrounded him flickered to life, showing what appeared to be a medieval castle under siege. David smiled as he recognized the scenario from multiple historical examples he had read about during his lunch breaks. The interface was surprisingly intuitive. David quickly figured out how to access information about available troops, resources, and the castle's defensive capabilities. The attacking force had superior numbers, but the defenders held the high ground and knew the terrain. According to his reading, the key to this type of scenario was to use the enemy's advantages against them. Instead of trying to defend every section of the castle walls, David concentrated his forces at strategic choke points. He positioned archers where they could create overlapping fields of fire and used the castle's architecture to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. When siege engines appeared, David had his engineers prepare countermeasures based on techniques he remembered from Roman military manuals. The simulation responded to his tactics in real time, with enemy forces adapting to his defensive strategies. David found himself genuinely enjoying the intellectual challenge as he drew on knowledge from dozens of historical sources. When the attackers attempted to tunnel under the walls, he implemented counter-tunneling techniques. When they tried to scale the walls with ladders, he had defenders pour boiling oil from prepared positions. The scenario ended with a decisive victory for the defenders, achieved with minimal casualties. David's platform immediately shifted to present a new challenge, a naval battle involving ancient warships. Again, he recognized the basic parameters from historical studies and began applying lessons from maritime warfare. As the challenges became more complex, David began to notice something interesting. While the other champions seemed to struggle when scenarios moved outside their areas of expertise, he was finding connections between different types of problems. Resource management principles from siege warfare applied to naval logistics. Communication strategies from ancient armies translated to coordinating space-based operations. His years of helping library patrons had taught him that knowledge from different fields often connected in unexpected ways. A question about gardening might lead to chemistry, which could connect to cooking, which might involve cultural history. Information was interconnected, and the same research skills that helped him navigate reference databases were helping him solve tactical puzzles. David also noticed that many scenarios weren't just testing his ability to win, but his ability to achieve objectives with minimal violence and maximum efficiency. When faced with a hostage situation, David found a negotiated solution that saved everyone instead of just eliminating threats. When confronting a rebellion, he addressed the underlying social problems that had caused the uprising. On the platform beside him, Krog was struggling with a diplomatic scenario that required subtle negotiation rather than direct confrontation. The massive warrior's straightforward approach was failing repeatedly, and David could see him growing frustrated. "Try focusing on what the other side actually needs," David called out, hoping his voice would carry between platforms. "Most conflicts happen because people want something they can't get through normal channels." Krog looked over in confusion. "What do you mean, small human?" "Instead of trying to force them to stop, try to understand why they're doing what they're doing," David explained. "If you can figure out their real motivations, sometimes you can find solutions that work for everyone." David wasn't sure if Krog understood, but he saw the warrior pause his simulation and study the scenario more carefully. Instead of immediately choosing violent options, Krog's character began communicating with the opposing faction leaders. This interaction gave David an important insight. Each champion was being tested not just on their strengths, but specifically on their weaknesses. Krog was being given problems that required finesse instead of force. Nira was dealing with scenarios that couldn't be solved through superior technology. Senna was facing situations where stealth and elimination weren't viable options. But David's challenges seemed different. Instead of exploiting his weaknesses, they were allowing him to apply his natural skills in unexpected contexts. Every scenario could be approached through research methodology, resource allocation, and systematic problem-solving. As the trials continued, David found himself naturally sharing insights with the other champions. When Nira became stuck on a logistics problem involving supply chains across multiple star systems, David explained resource management techniques he had learned from coordinating interlibrary loan programs. When Senna faced a scenario requiring team coordination, David shared communication strategies he used when organizing community events at the library. The alien officials observing from the control chamber were clearly not expecting this level of cooperation. David could hear them debating whether champions should be allowed to communicate during individual trials. "This collaboration is highly irregular," one official complained. "The trials are designed to assess individual capabilities, not group problem-solving skills." However, another pointed out, "the regulations do not explicitly forbid communication between participants, and the humans' approach is producing interesting results." High Commander thus looked increasingly agitated as David continued to progress through scenarios that should have been impossible for someone with no military training. More concerning was the way the other champions were beginning to adapt collaborative approaches to their own challenges. David's final scenario was the most complex he had faced. He was given command of a multi-system defense network facing an overwhelming invasion by technologically superior forces. The enemy had better ships, more advanced weapons, and the tactical advantage of choosing when and where to attack. Traditional military doctrine would suggest the defense was hopeless, but David approached it like any complex research problem. He gathered all available information about the enemy forces, analyzed their movement patterns and tactical preferences, and looked for connections that might not be immediately obvious. He studied the economic factors driving the invasion, the political relationships between the threatened systems, and the historical context of the conflict. Then he did something that surprised everyone watching. Instead of focusing solely on military solutions, David opened diplomatic channels with the invading fleet. He offered to negotiate about the underlying issues that had prompted the invasion in the first place. The simulation paused for several moments, as if the system was processing an unexpected input. Then new options appeared on David's displays, offering pathways toward negotiated settlements, trade agreements, and peaceful coexistence. "Impossible," High Commander Thos shouted from the observation chamber. "That scenario has no diplomatic resolution protocols." "Actually," reported a technician, "the simulation includes adaptive learning algorithms. It responds to approaches that demonstrate genuine strategic innovation, rather than just tactical knowledge." David successfully negotiated a comprehensive peace agreement that addressed the economic problems driving the invasion while establishing beneficial trade relationships between the former enemies. The simulation ended with a celebration rather than a body count, and David's platform gently returned him to the central staging area. The other champions had completed their trials as well, and David was pleased to see that they had all succeeded beyond their initial capabilities. Krog had resolved his diplomatic scenario using David's advice about addressing underlying needs. Nira had found innovative solutions by applying collaborative problem-solving techniques. Even Senna had learned to work effectively with team members instead of operating in isolation. "The results are unprecedented," announced one of the evaluating officials. "All 4 champions have demonstrated advanced strategic thinking that extends far beyond their apparent specializations." High Commander Thos looked like he had eaten something unpleasant. "This is not how the trials are supposed to function. Competition should drive individual excellence, not collaborative problem-solving. The strongest should dominate the weak, not help them improve." David raised his hand politely. "Excuse me, Commander, but could I ask a question about the purpose of these trials?" The chamber fell silent. David continued, "Are these tests designed to identify the strongest individual warrior, or are they meant to evaluate civilizations that would be valuable contributors to a galactic community?" It was a simple question, but David could see that it had struck something important. The alien officials began arguing among themselves, and their debate sounded different this time. Some were questioning fundamental assumptions about the trial system itself. High Commander Thos glared down at David with obvious hostility. "The trials identify strength and worthiness through individual combat and competitive excellence. That is how it has always been. But what if there's a better way?" David asked quietly. "What if cooperation and shared knowledge could accomplish more than competition and individual achievement?" The debate that followed revealed deep philosophical divisions among the alien officials. David began to suspect that he was learning something important about the nature of the hegemony itself, and he had a feeling that High Commander Thos was not going to appreciate where this investigation was leading. Starlight filtered through transparent walls as the transport vessel approached the capital world of the hegemony. David pressed his face against the viewing port and stared in amazement at what lay ahead. The planet was covered with structures that reached into the upper atmosphere, connected by bridges and transport tubes that created a 3-dimensional web of civilization across the entire world. Everything was built on a scale designed to make visitors feel insignificant. Buildings stretched higher than mountains, and the spaces between them could have housed entire cities. Even the transport corridors were vast enough to fly starships through. David got the distinct impression that the architects had been more interested in intimidating visitors than creating efficient spaces. "Impressive, is it not?" asked his escort, an alien who resembled a cross between a bird and a lizard. With iridescent feathers and intelligent golden eyes, the capital represents the accumulated achievements of 1,000 conquered worlds. David considered this statement carefully. "When you say conquered, do you mean they joined willingly, or were they forced to participate?" The escort tilted its head in a gesture that might have been surprise. "Most champions ask about the military capabilities or defensive systems. You inquire about political processes?" "I'm curious about how decisions are made," David replied. "In my experience, understanding how systems work is usually more important than knowing how strong they are." His quarters in the guest facility were larger than his entire apartment back in Portland. The main room included living and sleeping areas, a bathroom with facilities designed for multiple species, and what appeared to be a private study filled with books and data storage devices from across the galaxy. "I thought you might appreciate the research collection," his escort explained. "These are historical records from civilizations that have participated in the trials over the past millennium." David spent the first several hours exploring the collection with genuine excitement. The materials were organized by world of origin, but David approached them with the systematic methodology he used for any research project. He looked for patterns, cross-references, and information that might not be obvious when viewing individual sources in isolation. What he discovered was deeply troubling. The records showed that the trials of Dominion had been conducted for thousands of years, involving hundreds of different worlds. But when David searched for follow-up information about civilizations that had won their trials, he found very little data. Most seemed to simply vanish from the historical record after their supposed victory. Even more concerning were the individual champion records. David found detailed accounts of warriors from dozens of species who had successfully completed the trials and been celebrated as heroes. But none of them appeared to have returned to their home worlds. Instead, they had all been assigned positions within the hegemony's administrative structure, and then the record simply stopped. David was still researching when an announcement echoed through his quarters. Final preparations for the ultimate trial would begin shortly, and he was expected to report for briefing and equipment assignment. But instead of preparing for combat, David decided to do what librarians do when they need information that isn't readily available. He went looking for the primary sources. Locating the hegemony's central archives turned out to be surprisingly straightforward. David simply asked for directions, and the helpful beings he met assumed he had legitimate research business there. The archive facility itself was breathtaking in scope, with sections devoted to the complete historical records of every world in the Empire. The archive staff were delighted to meet someone who genuinely appreciated their work. Most visitors were government officials or military personnel who treated the archives as an inconvenient source of required data. David was the first person in recent memory who seemed truly interested in their organizational systems and preservation methodologies. We have been attempting to create a comprehensive cross-referencing system for military records, explained the chief archivist. A being that appeared to be made of living crystal that refracted light into complex patterns. Unfortunately, the officials keep changing classification protocols without consulting us. That sounds incredibly frustrating, David sympathized. Have you considered implementing a parallel system that maintains backward compatibility while allowing for systematic expansion? Within 2 hours, David was collaborating with a team of alien archivists on improving their cataloging methodologies. In return, they provided him with access to classified records that contained information about the true purpose of the Trials of Dominion. What David discovered in those restricted files completely changed his understanding of the trials. The competitions weren't really about identifying the strongest warriors or the most worthy civilizations. They were about identifying potential threats to the hegemony's power structure and eliminating them before they could become dangerous. Any world that produced a champion capable of winning the trials was automatically classified as a security risk. The victorious champions weren't celebrated and returned home as heroes. They were quietly eliminated, and their home worlds were subjected to much more intensive oversight and control. The trials were an elaborate trap, designed to identify and remove the most capable leaders from potentially rebellious civilizations. The system had been established after a previous galactic government had been overthrown by a coalition of worlds that had learned to cooperate instead of competing against each other. The hegemony maintained its authority by ensuring that member worlds remained isolated and focused on individual competition rather than collaborative resistance. This information is extremely sensitive, the chief archivist warned David. If the High Command discovers that you have accessed these records, the consequences could be severe for all of us. Why are you sharing this with me? David asked. The crystalline being shimmered with what David interpreted as emotion. Because you are the first champion in living memory who has demonstrated interest in learning, rather than just winning. And because we have grown weary of maintaining records of civilizations destroyed by their own desire for individual glory. David spent the remainder of the night reading everything he could find about the hegemony's control mechanisms, the histories of subjugated worlds, and the few documented cases of successful resistance movements. When morning arrived, he felt like he finally understood what he was really fighting against. The final trial arena was enormous beyond comprehension, capable of holding millions of spectators. Representatives from worlds across the galaxy had gathered to witness the competition, and David could see that many looked more frightened than excited about the proceedings. High Commander Thos stood at the center of the arena beside a figure that made David's blood run cold. The being was roughly humanoid in shape, but everything about it seemed fundamentally wrong. Its movements were too precise. Its facial expression was completely blank, and its eyes showed no sign of consciousness or individual personality. Behold War Prime Drakthos, Thos announced to the assembled crowd. Champion of the hegemony and victor of countless trials, your human challenger will face him in single combat to determine the fate of his species. David looked up at the viewing platforms and saw familiar faces. Nira, Krog, and Senna were there, along with what he assumed were representatives from their respective homeworlds. They looked worried, and David suspected they were beginning to understand what he had learned in the archives. But David also noticed something else in the crowd. The alien archivists he had worked with were scattered throughout the audience, positioned near what appeared to be communication equipment. David wondered if they had been as busy during the night as he had been. The rules are simple, Thos continued. Combat will continue until one champion yields or is defeated. There are no restrictions on weapons, tactics, or duration. War Prime Drakthos drew a weapon that looked like it could slice through starship armor. David looked down at his own basic equipment and realized that he had no hope of defeating this enemy through traditional combat methods, which was perfectly acceptable, because David had no intention of fighting this battle according to the hegemony's expectations. "Before we begin," David called out, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's acoustics, "I would like to exercise my right to make a formal pre-combat statement." Thos looked irritated. "What right? There is no such provision in the standard trial protocols." "Actually," David replied, producing a data crystal he had prepared during his research, "according to Hegemony Charter Section 47, subsection 12, any champion has the right to address the assembled representatives before engaging in formal combat. The provision has been invoked exactly 4 times in the past millennium, but it has never been repealed or modified." The arena fell silent as officials scrambled to verify David's claim. David smiled as he heard the familiar sound of bureaucrats discovering that someone had actually read the fine print. "The provision is technically valid," one official finally announced. "The champion may speak, but the statement must be brief and relevant to the proceedings." David looked up at the millions of beings watching from the arena, and the billions more watching through transmissions across the galaxy. Then he began to share everything he had learned about the true nature of the trials of Dominion, and exactly why the entire system was designed to keep them all enslaved. Silence filled the vast arena as David stood in its center, surrounded by millions of beings from hundreds of different worlds. The scale was overwhelming, but David had given presentations before, usually to small groups of library volunteers or community organizations. The principles were the same, he told himself. Share information clearly, support your claims with evidence, and help people understand why the topic matters to them personally. "My name is David Wells, and I am not a warrior," he began. His voice amplified throughout the stadium and broadcast across the galaxy. "I am a substitute librarian from Portland, Oregon, and I am here because of a clerical error. But sometimes accidents can lead to important discoveries." High Commander Thos was clearly growing impatient, but the formal protocols David had invoked prevented any interruption. Around the arena, David could see alien officials frantically consulting legal databases to find a way to stop him from continuing. "Over the past several days, I have had the opportunity to study the hegemony's historical archives," David continued, "and I have learned some very important things about these trials that I believe you all have the right to know." David activated the data crystal he carried, and holographic displays materialized throughout the arena, showing documents from the classified archives. The crowd stirred as they began to recognize official hegemony seals and security classifications. "The trials of Dominion are not what they appear to be," David announced. "They are not competitions to determine which civilizations deserve independence or membership in a galactic community. They are traps designed to identify and eliminate potential leaders who might challenge the hegemony's authority." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Representatives from dozens of worlds began shouting in their various languages, creating a cacophony of anger, fear, and confusion. David waited for the noise to subside before continuing his presentation. "According to these official records, every champion who has ever won these trials has vanished shortly after their victory. Their homeworlds have not gained the promised autonomy or improved status. Instead, they have faced increased surveillance, taxation, and control." Additional holographic displays showed detailed records of disappeared champions and the subsequent fate of their civilizations. David could see recognition and horror spreading through the crowd as representatives realized what had happened to their own historical heroes. "But that is not the most significant thing I discovered," David said. "The most important revelation is that this entire system was created specifically to prevent worlds from cooperating with each other. The previous galactic government was overthrown by civilizations that learned to work together instead of competing. The hegemony maintains its power by keeping us isolated and focused on individual achievement rather than collective action." High Commander Thos finally found his voice. "Silence. These are fabrications and lies designed to undermine legitimate governmental authority." "Are they fabrications?" David asked calmly. He gestured toward War Prime Drakthos, who had remained motionless throughout the speech. Let me ask you something about your champion. Is he truly the greatest warrior in the galaxy, or is he something else entirely? David had spent considerable time researching everything available about War Prime Drakthos. What he had discovered was that the supposed champion wasn't really a sentient being at all, but a sophisticated biological weapon controlled by cybernetic implants. Drakthos had once been a real person, but that individual had been effectively erased and replaced with programmable combat systems. War Prime Drakthos, David called out. Can you tell us your original name? Can you remember what world you came from before you became the hegemony's weapon? The figure that was supposed to be the galaxy's greatest warrior turned to look at David with completely blank eyes. When he spoke, his voice was mechanical and emotionless. I am War Prime Drakthos. I serve the hegemony of worlds. I have no other identity or purpose. That is not a person, David said to the crowd. That is a slave. The hegemony took someone who was probably a genuine champion from a real world, and they turned him into a programmable instrument of control. Is this the kind of glory you want for your own champions? The arena erupted in chaos. Representatives from different worlds were arguing with each other and demanding explanations from hegemony officials. Some were calling for immediate investigations. Others were attempting to leave, and many were simply trying to understand the implications of what they had just learned. But David was not finished with his presentation. He looked up at the viewing platform where Nira, Krog, and Senna were watching, and he smiled. During his research, he had discovered something remarkable about the recent trials. For the first time in hegemony history, champions from different worlds had begun collaborating instead of just competing against each other. The trials I participated in were different from all previous competitions, David continued, not because I won them, but because all of us learned to help each other instead of trying to defeat each other. We shared information, collaborated on solutions, and treated each other as allies rather than enemies. David activated another section of his data crystal, and the displays showed recordings from the recent trials. The audience could see Krog learning diplomatic techniques, Nira developing collaborative problem-solving approaches, and Senna working effectively with team members. This is what the hegemony fears most, David explained. Not individual strength or superior technology, but cooperative collaboration. They maintain their authority by keeping us isolated and competitive. But we do not have to continue playing by their rules. Throughout the arena, David could see the alien archivists he had worked with. They were discreetly distributing data crystals containing copies of all the classified information David had discovered. Other beings were beginning to network with each other, sharing contact information and discussing what they had learned. High Commander Thos had clearly had enough of David's presentation. This mockery ends immediately, he roared. War Prime Drakthos, eliminate the human challenger now. The cybernetic champion raised his weapon and advanced on David with mechanical precision. But David did not try to run or defend himself. Instead, he did something that no one in the arena expected. He walked directly toward Drakthos and began speaking to him like he would address any library patron who needed assistance. I know you are still in there somewhere, David said quietly, close enough now that only Drakthos could hear him. I know they have taken away your memories and your choices, but the person you used to be still exists inside that programming. Drakthos paused, his weapon raised but not striking. For a moment, something flickered behind his blank expression. I know what it feels like to be trapped by systems that do not care about you as an individual, David continued, but you have a choice right now. You can remain their weapon or you can choose to be yourself again. I serve the hegemony, Drakthos said, but his voice was less mechanical than before. No, David replied gently. You serve whoever programmed you to serve. But programming can be changed and choices can be made. You can decide who you want to be. The weapon in Drakthos's hand began to tremble. Around the arena, the crowd had gone completely silent, watching this impossible confrontation between a librarian and the galaxy's most feared champion. My name, Drakthos said slowly, his voice becoming more human with each word. My name was Take your time, David encouraged. There is no urgency. Sometimes the most important information is the most difficult to recover. Matthias, Drakthos whispered, and the weapon fell from his hands with a metallic clang that echoed through the silent arena. My name was Matthias. I was a teacher. I taught children on New Geneva before they... The revolution that followed was not violent or destructive. It was informational and organizational. Across the galaxy, worlds that had been isolated and competitive for centuries began communicating with each other directly. They shared resources, knowledge, and mutual support. The hegemony's control system, which depended entirely on keeping civilizations divided and suspicious, simply collapsed when people started working together. David never became a traditional hero in the classical sense. He never led armies or conquered territories or defeated enemies in single combat. Instead, he did what librarians have always done throughout history. He made information freely available to everyone who needed it, and he helped people find the resources they were looking for. 8 months later, David was back in Portland, but the library had been transformed beyond recognition. It was now the Earth headquarters of the Galactic Knowledge Exchange, a cooperative network of libraries and research institutions spanning hundreds of worlds. The old card catalogs had been replaced with databases containing the accumulated wisdom of entire civilizations. Mrs. Chen still came in every day to check her email, though now she was also participating in a cultural exchange program with a correspondent on Centauri, Prime. Mr. Thompson had started a discussion group where he shared Earth history with alien visitors while learning about their own civilizations. The college students who used to simply study for exams were now collaborating on research projects with scholars from across the galaxy. David was officially still a substitute librarian, though his business cards now included titles like Interplanetary, Information Coordinator, and Galactic Reference Specialist. He had been offered positions with more impressive titles and significantly better compensation, but he preferred his current work. After all, someone still needed to make sure Mrs. Chen could get help with her computer problems. On quiet afternoons when the library was peaceful and the intergalactic communication systems were running smoothly, David would sometimes reflect on the trials and what they had actually accomplished. The galaxy had not been saved through strength or cunning or advanced technology. It had been saved through the simple recognition that information belongs to everyone, and that the most effective way to solve complex problems is to work together. Matthias visited occasionally, along with Nira, Krog, and Senna. They had all returned to their homeworlds as genuine heroes, but more importantly, they had returned as educators and organizers who helped their civilizations participate in the growing network of cooperative worlds. Sometimes David wondered what would have happened if the Pentagon had selected the correct David Wells, the military specialist instead of the substitute librarian. He suspected that Warrior would have fought courageously and died honorably, and the galaxy would have continued under hegemony control for another 1,000 years. But David preferred not to speculate about alternative histories. He had learned that the most important victories are not won through violence or competition. They are achieved by sharing knowledge, building connections, and remembering that everyone deserves access to the information they need to make informed decisions about their own lives. And that, David thought as he helped a young visitor from the Rigel system with her research project about Earth's library sciences, was exactly the kind of work that made being a librarian the best job in any galaxy.